to our presentation on sea monsters or strange and uncommon sea animals. My name is Brin. I'm an associate curator with the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort. I'm particularly excited to give this presentation today because I've been giving a sea monster presentation for probably about just over 10 years now. And yesterday I got it in my head to completely renovate it. So you get to be my test audience for my newly renovated version of it. It's still great, don't worry. It's still fun. We're going to learn all about different sea monsters. Before we dive into sea monsters, though, I do want to revisit the fact this is part of the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort's lecture series. We do have another lecture that is coming up on October 23rd. It is called The Collection Will Kill You, Identifying and Addressing Hazardous Materials in Your Collection. And that'll be given by our museum conservator, Michelle Crepeau, if you're interested. Our lectures are also all live streamed through Zoom and recorded. They can hear me. They cannot see me. They can hear me. They can see my slideshow. They cannot hear you, and they cannot see you. Just being clear on that. That being said, our presentations are then posted onto YouTube. So if you want to learn more, revisit this presentation or any other topic from our lecture series, please visit our YouTube page and enjoy them. And I think I covered everything there. Did I? Yes. Yay. So diving into sea monsters, today I get to tell you about some amazing sea creatures or sea monsters that come out of the Atlantic Ocean. We're going to get to explore sea monsters such as one that we're going to look at has over 100 sharp teeth in its mouth. Another one has fangs so long that it could pierce its own brain. And another that can grow up to 100 feet long. They're really amazing creatures, and they give you this great appreciation for what our oceans look like and how amazing the Atlantic Ocean can be, and terrifying, I will say. A lot of times when we think of sea monsters, we have these general concepts or visual images of what they look like. And I will tell you that the father of those kind of popular images of what our sea monsters look like come from Magus here. He, in 1539, just before that, he spent about 12 years working on a chart. He was a Swedish writer, cartographer, and Catholic clergyman, and he spent 12 years on a project to complete and create what is considered the most accurate map of any part of Europe up until that time. And you can see quite a lot is going on here, but what stands out for our purposes is his illustrations of sea monsters right here. Now, often when you talk to a lot of other historians about sea monster illustrations on charts such as these, they will try to tell you that the cartographers put them on there for the simple purpose of selling their maps. They wanted to make them look better, and they thought people would buy them. That was not the case with our guy here. He actually was looking at the early studies of natural history at the time, looking at other studies that were published in the area, and what he thought he was documenting were actual animals that were living out in the ocean. And what's kind of cool is you're going to see some on here, like this one, which is called the Balenio. It's very much a whale. And so he's not completely off on everything, but he does have others, like our guy up here that we're going to get to talk about, the sea serpent, not quite accurate. But he becomes the father of what we today see as sea monsters and very largely recognize, because as the next 300 years go on, a lot of these images, this one, our guy getting attacked here, will keep showing up on chart after chart. They will start reinventing it. And we'll also see a number of natural historians and people studying animals continue, because after he completes this chart in 1539, he not only creates this amazing chart, but then goes and spends 16 years compiling hundreds, if not thousands, of different sources into his book series, where he explains every animal that he has on this chart, why and where the information comes from. It is an amazing source of information if you ever get a chance to look at it. And it is a beautiful chart to see in color. But he is the father of many of the sea monster images, and I used him as a main source for looking at where our sea monsters came from and who what they might actually be. There you go. So studying history, we have two sea monsters that may arguably be considered the first sea monster documented. And that could be either what we would call the Leviathan or the mermaid. And that is because these monsters come from the original Babylonian epic of creation. In that story, they talk about the mother goddess Tiamat and how she was the salt water of the early ocean, and her husband Apsu, who was the fresh water. Tiamat is commonly shown as being illustrated as being a Leviathan, is what they call her. And then her husband is also seen as very often illustrated as being a merman. So it's right there neck and neck as to which would be considered the original sea monster. But the Leviathan is where we're going to start off with because she was pretty epic in this tale. He played a little bit of a secondary role. The Leviathan is a term that is interestingly used very interchangeably with dragons. It is described as an immense and monstrous form. This fearsome beast is evoked in a lot of different shapes. We see it showing up in a lot of Judeo-Christian writings. That's interestingly shown as both a more of a reptilian form, as you can see here, and more snake-like, and then does occasionally show up as more of a mammal form as well, consistently flying. This is one of the earliest images I have of the dragon here, and they do go by a lot of different names throughout different stories. The Leviathan is said to embody the powers of the sea, which tends to be a very consistent part of the Leviathan story, and the dragon even. Though not all dragons are associated with the ocean, it does tend to be a very popular theme throughout many different cultures, that they either live in water, have a water power, live near it. And the word dragon, Leviathan, and whale are interestingly used interchangeably in a lot of these papers, early studies of sea animals and sea monsters. So it would appear that our early dragons and our early leviathans were probably whales out in the ocean being misidentified and being considered more as a terrifying. So these two come from Magus's illustration here, and you can see these are images of actual whales out in the ocean that we've taken. And if you take a look at these images, you can see how a sailor in their early years of exploring the ocean could think this creature is flying. That does very much look like it has wings. And then we have this guy here. We know today this is water spray coming out, but to someone who had not had the chance to get up and close to a whale, very much could look like smoke, which would lead you to believe that there is fire going on inside of that creature's mouth. These animals do have the ability, the whales, to get about 60 to 70 feet long, which is terrifying if you're on a boat that's only about 50 feet long trying to cross the ocean. Another sea monster that we hear about that's very well known is that of the sea serpent. It's probably the most often cited sea monster, one that I hear about the most. It was the earliest documentation I found for it is 1734 AD, and probably the best known sea serpent style monster is the Loch Ness monster, but they are found throughout the oceans. And just as with the dragon, there are thousands of regional stories that present different forms of this creature. So they don't always look just like this snake-like creature, but they do come very consistently with the same body type. There's two different, when we look at Magus's chart, he talks about the sea serpent, but he also talks about so he describes the sea serpent as a creature that's about 200 feet long and about 20 feet thick, and it wants to live in rocks and caves, and you can see it here attacking that ship. Now, today we've combined two of his sea monsters. So he has the sea serpent, and then he has what he calls the sea worm. And like I said, we've combined these two, but the sea worm he described as a worm that's blue and gray in color, and that is about 40 cubits long. yet is hardly so thick as the arm of a child, so a very long, skinny creature. And I bring this one up because in a little bit, we're going to find out that he may not have been too far off the mark when he described the sea worm as a sea monster. The sea serpent, like I said, was one of the most commonly spotted sea monsters around the world, and that includes right off of North Carolina's coast. We have ones here. We have the sea serpent off of Cape Hatteras. It was spotted in 1903, and there was an article that was put out about it. And specifically, what I want you to take away from it was the description that was given. It was a monster, was half dragon, had bloodshot eyes, protruding tusks, gaping jaws, and a vile smell. Now, what's really interesting for me is when I read firsthand accounts where people are talking about having encountered specifically the sea serpent, they continually reference the smell of the creature. There's one description later on where they'll describe the smell and say, oh, it uses its smell to lure like unsuspecting prey to it. I was like, I don't think that's how it works. If it stinks, they're not going to get near it, but okay. My theory, and some other historians share this theory, is that the vile smell is often a result of the fact that they're not seeing a living creature, but they're seeing a half-rotted animal that's probably floating in the water, and hence the vile smell. And the reason it doesn't necessarily look like an animal that they would be familiar with. I'm going to show you a few different North Carolina stories, but what I love about our North Carolina stories is the articles when they talk about people not misidentifying, but seeing these sea monsters. They're usually not locals, because the locals look at these animals and go, oh, it's a whale. Whereas people that are not as familiar with the local area have a tendency to look at them and not assume as much. So this one comes out of 1870. It was called a balloon fish off Cape Hatteras. And in this one, they described it as the serpent was found to be about 100 feet long, with a body 40 feet in length and a tail about 60 feet long. But what was the most curious feature of this creature was that it had what they called 12 foot in height and 40 feet in width, this kind of large bladder-shaped balloon that had blown up on it. And they go on to describe the feel of the balloon. I'm sorry, if I see a big balloon sea monster this big, I'm not touching it. But they touched it, which leads me to believe that this animal was not alive when they encountered it and was likely, once again, a dead whale that probably had flipped over and had like a baleen whale that would have had the ability to inflate their neck like that. And these are gases getting caught in there. But I'm not going to be the one that says there's no such thing as a sea monster. Could still be. This one is not from North Carolina. This one was an interesting article that I found where from 1915. This is a German U-boat U-28 that reported and officially went into the captain's logs as stating that they had encountered a sea monster on July, and according to an excerpt from the commander's logbook I have here, on July 30th, 1915, our U-28 torpedoed the British steamer named Iberian, which was carrying a rich cargo across the North Atlantic. The steamer sank so swiftly that its bow stuck up almost vertically into the air. Moments later, the hull of the Iberian disappeared. The wreckage remained beneath the water for approximately 25 seconds at the depth that was clearly impossible to assess, and when suddenly there was a violent explosion which shot pieces of debris, among them a gigantic aquatic animal, out of the water to a height of approximately 80 feet. Personally, I don't think it was 80 feet that it went up, but at this moment, I had with me in the conning tower 6 of my officers at the watch, including the chief engineer, the navigator, and the helmsman, which, side note, will all later to claim they have no memory of this incident and do not want to be associated with this story any longer. The captain goes on, we were unable to identify the creature, but all of us agreed that it resembled an aquatic crocodile, which was about 60 feet long with 4 limbs resembling large webbed feet, a long pointed tail, and a head, which was also tapered to a point. Unfortunately, we were not able to take a photograph, for the animal sank out of sight after 10 to 15 seconds. This image that I have here was created to accompany the story in the newspapers in 1915. Now, this is worth noting that we have this crocodile-like creature out there because not too long later, about 15 years in 1933, they report on another German U-boat, U-boat 108, that would claim to see a sea serpent, stating he saw a sea serpent at 10 p.m. without any possibility of doubt. The creature had a longish head, scales like a crocodile, and legs with proper feet. He would go on to state that the creature was about 90 feet long, and even the newspapers at the time connected this to the U-28. So for about 15 to 20 years, there's apparently a very large and scared alligator hanging out in the ocean. But there we have documented sea monsters out there. This is another one that comes out of North Carolina. 1897, there was a report that came that a frozen sea serpent was found near the Curator lighthouse with the engraving here. I know it's not a great engraving, but you can see, if you're familiar with how whale skeletons look, has very much a whale skeleton look to it for me, but also has a very good sea serpent look to it. So could go either way, but this was documented in Curator. In 1947, there was an article about a ship that would report hitting a sea monster off the coast of North Carolina. The crew would describe the incident by saying the creature's head, they would describe the creature as its head appeared to be about 2.5 feet across, 2 feet thick, and 5 feet long. I don't know, it's longer, that's about my height. The cylindrical shaped body was about 3 feet thick and the neck about 1.5 feet in diameter. Now you might ask why they don't talk about the body, the rest of the body of this creature, and that is simply because they ran into it and cut it in half. So they only got to see the top half of the body, which makes me question their ID on it, but sea monster. Now, we've had, as I meant, there have been sea serpents in general have been one of the most widely seen and cited sea creatures or sea monsters out there. And nobody's really been able to figure out what they were seeing. And about 200 years after Magus's publication came out, there was a bishop, and he claimed that he wrote his natural history about all different animals. And interestingly, he references Magus's publication in his, and he argues that Magus got some things wrong. We've had 2 years, we're enlightened, we know better. And he specifically says, this bishop goes on to say, mermen are obviously real, the Leviathan is obviously real, but the sea snake, obviously not real. Magus got it wrong. There's no way there is a sea snake out there that is 80 feet long. Interestingly, the bishop discounted the only real animal that I think was in that list. And you're going to see here, so this is an extreme case of an oarfish that was photographed in, so it says it was taken in 96. I don't think it was taken that recently, but it was posted in 96. And this is a 23-foot long, 300-pound oarfish right here that the Navy documented. Oarfish have the ability, they don't typically get this long. Different species of oarfish can get between 10 to 36 pounds. The maximum length one has been 600 pounds. So Magus wasn't too far off. Those sea snakes and maybe even sea serpents are out there, that we just know them by a different name today. So that is a real sea monster right there. We also know of the conger eel. These are larger creatures. We have the American eel, conger eel, that can get to be 6.5 feet long and 88 pounds at its full length. And then the European one, which can get up to 9 feet and 220 pounds. I'm sorry, if I saw a 9-foot long eel, I would immediately assume I was looking at a sea serpent. That is a sea monster for me. So that's the European one smiling at us here. And this is the American one right here for us. So sea serpents and sea snakes are real, just not man-devouring, thankfully. There's also the theory that some of the sea serpents that we see out there are actually whales and dolphins. And if you take a look here at these images of this one of a whale and that one of a dolphin, you can see how being in the water and potentially, and not obviously quite as close as we are with these images, it could be mistaken for being the back of a sea creature. So sea serpents, I'm going to argue, definitely real. If I was on Mythbusters right now, I'd say this one is busted because it's real. It's confirmed, I should say. Another sea monster that is well known and that Magus talks about is that of the Kraken. His image of the Kraken is very different, and he describes their forms are horrible, their heads are square, they're all set with prickles, and they have sharp and long horns round about like a tree rooted up by the roots, and they are 10 or 12 cubits long, very black with huge eyes. And this is his illustration of what the Kraken looks like. This will actually evolve a little bit, quite a bit beyond him, because the Kraken does later get re-illustrated and combined with the giant squid that you can see here. These are different versions from different charts later on. The Kraken is one of the older sea monsters we see documented. The first documentation of it is in 1180 AD. So just like with the Leviathan and the mermaid, we know that oral history or oral tales of them predate that significantly. The size of the Kraken varies, but the only thing that's really consistent about the Kraken between culture to culture is the fact that they always consistently are very squid-like or octopus-like, and they are almost always large enough to destroy a ship, which is key to being a sea monster, I guess. Yeah, there you go. Now, it's not hard to guess what actual animal probably inspired this discussion or the tales of the Kraken, that being the giant squid. Giant squid, which is, like I said, a real animal. The colossal squid can actually range between 39 to 46 feet long. This doesn't seem too bad to us today, but I want to put this in perspective. Christopher Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria, carried 40 men across the ocean, and it was only 70 feet long, with the Nina and Pinta measuring between 50 and 60 feet long. They would have spent 2 months on those ships exclusively, crossing an ocean, and potentially seen a giant squid that was more than half the size of their ships. Terrifying. And they wouldn't have seen the whole creature at once. They just would have seen, if they saw it, bits and pieces of it. And it would have looked like something that could obviously take their ship down. So you can see where, and if anybody's a fisherman here, I'm sorry, but fishermen are known for telling their stories a little exaggerated. So they might have come back from the ocean having seen a 20-foot squid and described it as an 80-foot squid. Not that anybody in Carteret County would ever do something like that. Another sea monster that is very well known is the mermaid or the siren. The mermaid is not something that a lot of we think of as a sea monster today, especially since the mermaid has started showing up in a lot of kids' cartoons. But a lot of the early tales about the mermaid, they're not very nice. They tend to be very vengeful spirits. They're dragging people into the water. They can be helpful in some cases, but they also can be exceptionally mean. And they fit all of the criteria for being a sea monster. This right here is a version of what a mermaid might have looked like. Not as attractive as, our movie star here, but different cultures. See, mermaids show up in almost universally every culture, coastal culture, and I've even found a few landlocked cultures that also have their own version of the mermaid tale. I'm only going to touch on it a little bit. I have a whole 45-minute presentation about the history of mermaids. If you ever want to see it, it's on YouTube. But mermaids do count as sea monsters. They show up everywhere. The only real consistency, like I said, with them is the human top and the fish bottom, but they do have a very range of actions and what they look like. They are in the running for being the oldest sea monster story. Now, I'm never going to say, like I said, they don't exist. Don't tell a sea monster that I ever said that. But not every mermaid sighting is a sighting of a mermaid. Some of those sightings may not have been, but we have some pretty legitimate sightings. And my call. I have yet to find anybody other than my 8-year-old daughter that can tell me they've seen a mermaid in Carteret County. So if you know of anybody that has claimed or any stories that say they've seen a mermaid off of North Carolina's coast, please let me know, because my 8-year-old daughter is not a legitimate source. But I will give you this very legitimate source of Christopher Columbus himself. During one of his voyages, writes down that he encountered mermaids in 1493. And what's great is his description is, after seeing the mermaids, goes, they're not half as beautiful as I expected them to be. And that is likely because he was not seeing mermaids. Like I said, not all sightings of mermaids are actually mermaids. Some of those sightings were more likely dolphins or manatees. And as you can see here in this image here of the manatee under the water or the dolphin under the water, you can understand how a sailor being up on a ship, being a little lonely, dreaming of other people, and not always the most hydrated or well-fed, might have started to fantasize and see human forms underneath there. That being said, I'm never going to be the one to tell a manatee or a dolphin that they're not a mermaid. Those dolphins have some species of dolphins can have up to 100 teeth in their mouths. They are whatever they want to be. So technically, a dolphin and a manatee are now sea monsters, according to my presentation. Now, about 200 years, I mentioned this guy already. Here's our bishop. About 200 years after Magus put out his chart and his 16 books, we have our bishop here who created his more updated version of the natural history. And he argues, like I said, for the existence of dragons and the Leviathan, claims the sea snake is definitely a printing error and a mistake on the part of Magus, saying that he clearly was combining history with fiction. But in his books that he puts out between 1752 and 1753, he had this intriguingly named chapter called Certain Sea Monsters or Strange and Uncommon Sea Animals, which inspired the title and the complete redo of my presentation, because I love the idea that sea monsters, well, they're just uncommon sea animals, which I've already shown you. The sea snake is real. It's just a creature, an oarfish, or mermaids are real. They're just dolphins and manatees. So I'm going to show you in the bishop's, based on this bishop's description of a sea monster being an uncommon sea animal, strange, a few more sea monsters. You guys are doing great. Thank you. So we've got the anglerfish here. I argue that if anybody had ever seen an anglerfish 300 years ago, immediately would have identified this as a sea monster. There's over 200 different species of the anglerfish. This image illustrates what's called the humpback anglerfish, and it's part of what is called, the species is actually called the black sea devils, and they're well known for their bizarre, and what I love is this is described in many official sources when they're describing how an anglerfish looks. They almost always describe them as having angry looking faces. That is their official description, angry looking faces. They move around with their charismatic kind of characteristic bioluminescent spine that emits a diffused blue light in the dark waters. They're known to be one of the ugliest animals on the planet. The females of this species can get to be about 7 inches long, whereas the males only get to be about 1 inch long. So very big difference between male versus female. They're found almost everywhere in the world in tropical to temperate waters, but especially we see them in like the China Seas, the South China Sea and East China Sea, And they're found in deep waters of the ocean with a minimum depth of about 3,000 feet. So they love it completely dark. So definitely a sea monster right there. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this guy, the goblin shark. Also, he's called a living fossil. They get to be about 10 to 13 feet long. He's also another deep guy. The name goblin shark comes from the Japanese translation of, I don't speak Japanese, so I apologize right now, Tenguzami. I tried looking it up. I tried repeating it. I think I got it. Tengu references a mythical creature with long nose and a red face. The goblin shark has semi-translucent skin, which means that their blood vessels can actually be seen through their skin, and that makes them look like different colors in different photos. So if you ever look them up, you're going to see them. They're going to look white in some pictures, gray in some pictures, pink in others. You're also going to see their long, pointy snout, which is very iconic for them, and their jaw, which very sea monster of them, they can actually launch their entire jaw forward and out of them, and thus expanding the length of their deadly bite. So they can launch that jaw out, and then it acts like a rubber band, catapulting forward, grabbing the prey, and retracting back inside of its mouth. They say that the speed that this jaw comes out, snatches, and comes back in is just terrifying. But it allows them to grip onto the fish and the squid that they go after. Sea monster, definitely. This one's my personal nightmare. I'm not a fan of spiders. They live outside. I live inside. We've got an agreement. This is sea spiders. There are over 1,300 different species of sea spiders documented. Their legs can range depending on the species. The smallest one has legs that measure about a ½ inch long. The longest ones have legs that measure 2 to 2.3 feet long. So imagine encountering a sea spider with legs almost 2.5 feet long. They are the deep sea species that have the longer legs. They're most recognizable by these long legs, and they have very small bodies in comparison, as you can see in my image here. And because of how small their bodies are, they've actually had to, what I call, outsource a lot of their organ functions into their legs. So inside of their legs, they will actually, some of the species do oxygen diffusion, absorb their oxygen through there, and some even do digestion inside, parts of their digestion system inside of their legs. To make these creatures even more terrifying, most of them, the way they eat is they will actually approach a sponge or a mollusk and force their straw-like proboscis into the animal's flesh and actually suck out their insides and eat them that way. Yeah, I know, horror movies just need to go to the ocean. This is right here, one of the most, yeah. I mentioned to you a sea monster I was going to show you that had fangs so long that it could pierce its own brain, and that is our fang tooth right here. They are appropriately named because they have two clear fangs you can see here in its mouth. The fangs are clear, and biologists believe that the reason they are clear is because this fish will swim around with its mouth open, and because the other fish or the prey cannot see those fangs, like I said, they're clear, they will swim right into this fish's mouth, unknowingly right into their doom and being eaten. The fang tooth has been found as deep as 16,000 feet, making it one of the deepest living fish. But more commonly, we see it in between about 1,600 and 6,000 feet deep. Their fangs are proportionally it's considered the longest proportional fangs out of any animal on Earth, in proportion to their body. They have sockets inside their skulls for those fangs to push into so they don't pierce their own brains. I know, terrifying stuff. I mentioned to you that sea monster, like all we have to do for literature is really look at what these sea creatures are already doing out in the ocean. H.G. Wells and, my gosh, I know my own people, and Herman Melville here, when writing their books 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Moby Dick, both openly acknowledged that they referenced Ogus's write-ups about sea monsters when looking for inspiration on how to describe things like the Leviathan or different sea monsters that they might encounter on their adventures. You can see here in the background some of those jellyfish that Wells would have described. These animals end up showing up in a variety. Later on, we also see War of the Worlds use the jellyfish as inspiration for their alien. And if you see any movies today that continue to show War of the Worlds, I think the most recent one was in 2003, but it's been remade many times. The jellyfish is very often the inspiration behind a lot of the designs. And I got to say, the jellyfish is probably the sea monster that can clear off a beach the quickest right now. Another sea monster that I'll show you that has a kind of Hollywood, has inspired Hollywood is the bobbit worm. The bobbit worm that you see here, it can get to be is a striking species. Depending on the species, it can be anywhere from 4 inches long to 10 feet long. And what it does is it uses its mandibles here, and it will actually to capture its prey, and they will come up out of the ground, use those mandibles to cut their prey in half and eat them that way. The 1990 film Tremors, the writers of that film openly acknowledged that they used the bobbit worm as inspiration, if you've ever gotten to see that movie. I've had other people come to me and say that Dune used the bobbit worm as inspiration for theirs, but Dune does not acknowledge using the bobbit worm. So we can only assume or guess that they got some inspiration from them because it is very similar in look and appearance. This is the smallest sea monster that I'm going to show you today. So this Phronema plankton does not get to be more than 1 inch long, and it is probably the most terrifying creature. And I don't like I may not be a fan of spiders, but I will tell you this one's probably the most terrifying out of them all. So the Phronema is a plankton, and what it does is it will kill its prey, and when it's ready to lay its eggs, will actually put its eggs inside of the body of its prey to feed those eggs and protect them until they're ready to hatch out. The image of the Phronema plankton and its practice of laying its eggs in its prey was used, and it is acknowledged that it was used as inspiration for the 1979 film Alien. If you take a look at this, if you're familiar with the design, I know they're coming out with a new version of Alien or a sequel to it very recently. The physical design of the alien was designed to look similar to what our plankton guy looks like here, along with that practice of laying eggs inside of their victims. The last one I'm going to show you is it's probably the funniest sea monster that I have up here, the sea cucumber. Not really too terrifying. He was used as inspiration in Hollywood to create one of their main villains on Jabba the Hutt, if you're familiar with him. And they have thick leathery skin, which goes stays consistent with the Jabba the Hutt. And interestingly, in the sea cucumber world, the neural tissue, what they use to think, is commonly located around their oral cavity, which means that they think with their mouths. And if you're familiar with the character of Jabba the Hutt, that stays consistent with his character design as well. I thank you all for joining me today for learning a little bit more about sea monsters. I can answer any questions you have, but if you want to learn more, these 2 books right here, these are all great sources. The 2 that are highlighted are my 2 main sources for this series. I have this one with me today if you want to take a look at it. But thank you very much for joining me. I hope you all have a great spooky season. And like I said, if you've ever seen a mermaid off of North Carolina's coast, let me know.